So over the past few weeks, we've been going over this series, Known by Love. We started this last week. And as we've been in this space, we've been trying to kind of get our sea legs, if you will. There's so much going on. The space is different. The audio works different here. The band is spread out further. Practice time works different. Everything seems to be working a little bit differently. And some in way better ways and some in just different ways. And so we're trying to get accustomed to how things are going. And as we're doing this, it's been so helpful to have Mission del Sol, who we rent from, be so supportive and loving and in communication with us. And I just thought, for your sake, because it not only encouraged myself and Tracy, that you might want to hear a bit from Mission del Sol's pastor, David Hodgson. He says in an email, "I asked Doug, our custodian, how things were being left for Sunday morning. He said he checked one Sunday morning just to see, and everything was absolutely perfect. So good job, cleaning crew. You do a great job. Except for one thing," he said, and he smiled. He said, "They have more children than we do, and I know that because of all the children's handprints left on the lower portion of the glass doors of the sanctuary. I begged him not to wipe them off. And I ask the same of you." Gosh, I get choked up. Now that Aaron's not here, someone has to keep the crying going. Come on, guys. I will take the torch. "And I ask the same of you. I want to celebrate the fact that children have already left their mark on our church campus. Blessings, David." And then I want to read you one last postscript from Susan Hernandez, who is and was such a vital part in organizing the whole rental agreement process and us viewing this space. And she says in her email, "P.S. I overheard a few people talking that they felt a positive energy in the sanctuary and believed that it was because we had one church in there the night before, and it must be God working. God bless." All the feels, right? How incredible that something as simple as the handprints of children and this collective energy of our community could make such an impact on this space. On people we haven't even met yet. We've only met a few of them, but they can see it in small little ways and feel it. And this warms my heart to know that our community, that our intentions to be safe, to be loving, to be inclusive, to be a community, can be felt unseen by another community. So congratulations to all of you, first of all, because it's this energy. It's all of you. And this reminds me of a parable that I was told when I was a kid, of the tree and its fruit. And some of you might have heard this story before, that it's during Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he basically likens a religious teacher to its teachings, basically being like a tree and its fruit. And so that basically, just as a bad tree that's unhealthy, it bears bad fruit, so does a false teacher who's basically like a wolf in sheep's clothing, like a mask, pretending to be something that it's not, claiming to be one thing, but seemingly another. And that a good tree that's healthy and full of life and energy and love, it bears good fruit. And just like a teacher who is basically just like a good teacher who brings goodness and abundance, or you could say a community that brings goodness and abundance. Because you can tell a lot about someone or something or a belief by its fruit. And I know that's such a strange analogy, but you can. What does it bring forth? This is why some of you left your previous faith communities. It's why you were tired of them appearing some way sickeningly sweet and all put together, but continually producing rancid fruit. I'm convinced that when it comes to our theology, to our beliefs about God, that we ought to examine its fruit. And I'm going to continue to use the Christianese language here because it really does apply. And if you've ever owned a fruit tree, which my wife and I have a few, and we don't know how to take care of them, and we're doing our best, you realize it takes gentle care, and there's a lot to be put into it for it to bear this fruit. You can't just pretend like really bad fruit comes out of something unhealthy. It has to be nurtured and loved and taken care of. And that I'm convinced that we have to examine it again and again, because when we ask things like, does that particular belief draw others to the divine, to love, to health, to wholeness and inclusion? Or does that particular belief and theology leave others excluded, no matter who they are, or judged, or fractured, or shamed? You can tell a lot by its fruit. You can claim to be anything, but at the end of the day, the old phrase goes, the proof is in the pudding. Have you guys ever heard of that one? I am kind of a geek when it comes to random, useless knowledge that really doesn't serve me well anywhere in life except for this job, honestly. Anywhere else, it's not helpful. How many of you have heard of that phrase and know where it comes from? Oh, I knew Matt. Of course Matt would. Matt is the only other person I know that's like, yeah, I know the useless random facts and knowledge. So it dates back to the 14th century, during a time when pudding wasn't the kind of pudding that we know of today. It wasn't this sweet treat that we get excited to eat after dessert. Often, pudding was like a savory dish. It was like the meal, the savory dish, that was made up of boiled leftover animal parts and oatmeal. Who's hungry? Really good. Trust me, friends, this was no chocolate snack pack. No, this was not something you want to just mow down on. And the words of wisdom, the proverb used to say, all the proof of a pudding is in the eating. Meaning, you had to actually do a taste test first to understand if this pudding was going to be any good or not. Because sometimes it was okay and savory and decent, and other times it was horrible and rancid, and sometimes would even make you sick or you'd be poisoned. So at first it became like this word of wisdom, like, hey, you should try it first. And then it became a proverb that basically was the essence of saying that time would tell, time would reveal if something was good or bad. And when you can barely stomach something because it's disguised as something that's supposed to be nourishing and good, this is why most people stay away from pudding altogether. You know I'm talking about more than pudding, right? You know I'm talking about more than fruit and trees, right? Replace those words with religion or church or faith or pastors or spiritual leader or the Bible or doctrine or theology. All of that kind of gets lumped in here. I'm talking about when something is supposed to be known for one thing, and yet we receive something often bitter in its place. And it's no wonder that people are leaving religion by the droves. Because the thing it's supposed to be known for love, they simply aren't finding it. So last week we started our new series, Known by Love, and I mentioned it before that it's hinged around this scripture in John 13, where Jesus, he says to his disciples that basically if they love one another, that this love is the thing that everyone would know that they follow him. That the mark of a Jesus follower is simply that, love. It's not your doctrine, it's not your theology, it's not your belief, it's not this, it's not that, it's love. Now, as an aside, I do have to note that Christianity does not have the market cornered on love. I think we all know that. Humankind can love. And even the Christian scriptures that states in 1 John 4:7, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever loves knows God. It's really that simple. I think we make it very complex. It's really that simple. Love is a universal language, and it's my desire that we all become fluent in it. But like a language, it takes time. I took about 3 years of Spanish, and I probably can say like 4 sentences. Enough to like, where's the bathroom? I need a drink. Where's this? Where's that? It takes practice. You have to practice a language. And so no matter how much it takes or how much we have to practice it, no matter how much we have to go through it, that we would all speak love. Christian, atheist, agnostic, every faith in between. That is my desire. Because If Jesus tells his disciples that they're known for their love, you better believe that Jesus is pointing to love. That a couple weeks ago I referenced the finger pointing to the moon. Jesus, the finger pointing to the moon. Love, love, love. Follow the way of love. Not your superior morality, not your knowledge and your theology, or your quickness to point out so-and-so's flaws, or your quickness to point out all the wonderful, beautiful things, but no, just simply the mark of a follower is love. And it's such a simple concept, and yet it's so difficult to practice. Am I right? I mean, it's a really beautiful, easy, simple-sounding concept, and yet it's anything but easy. It's very difficult. And so to be known by love, I think we have to first know love ourselves. And that's something that I think we ought to explore is what is love? And how many of you are now singing that song in your head? I got a few of you. If you were born anywhere, or I shouldn't say if you were born in the 80s, you probably, if you've ever seen Night at the Roxbury, What is Love? Okay. As I mentioned last week, there are many different types of love. You can love your parents, you can love your spouse, your partner, your significant other, your dog, your friends, your pizza, your job. Love, love, love. But that expression should be hopefully different between all of these things. It's expressed very differently. And the ancient Greeks understood that this multifaceted expression had multiple words for what we sum up in one single word. And they often did this in Greek language. Many words for what we use as one word. There was philia, which is brotherly love. And it's the one that you see in friendships. So it's the one where kindness reacts to kindness. And it's mirrored. And it's where you basically have this easy and comfortable connection with others. But it also can be quickly strained when there's a crisis. So it's a bond and a connection, but maybe doesn't have a real long-lasting strength. Then there is Eros, which is erotic or passionate love, named after the Greek god Eros, who was the god of sexual passion. I mentioned this before, but I am a Greek mythology nerd, so I studied all about this and found it so fascinating that a lot of the words that we get in our language are all rooted back to this time period. And this kind of love was more of an emotional and body kind of love. And it really served as self-satisfaction. So we're really talking about ourself here. It's kind of that infatuation, lust. Then we have storge, which is a familial love. Now, this is a natural bond or affection between spouses, partners, kids, or even a familiarity of certain people. So others maybe kind of like you. And it's a quiet, steady love that's often really found with empathy. So it's either family or you know what I'm talking about, chosen family. And we all have those people where there's your born family and then there's your chosen family. And that is storge. And then we've all heard this before, I'm sure. If you've been raised around any type of Christian faith, you've heard the word agape. Agape is like an infinite or divine love. That this divine love is basically the great love, if you will. It's the higher love. It's the highest form of love, a sacrificial and selfless love. The word Jesus is using in John 13 for love is this word, agape, which some of you have heard before. As I mentioned, in some, this is new. And so if it's new, I'll take a moment to dive in on that. The word agape was rarely used in Greek-speaking societies. But in the New Testament, it occurs 320 times. So it's really interesting that this, pause for a minute, was a word or a concept that maybe was a little unfamiliar. They knew this word, but rarely used it. And yet, the New Testament comes on the scene because Jesus comes on the scene, and all of a sudden there's this word agape. And it gets used often, and Jesus uses this word often. Since the New Testament is saturated with this word, we get this sense that Jesus' teachings are continually pointing to this, to a higher love, to a higher love. And every time I say higher love, I keep thinking of, bring me a higher love. Come on, anybody? You with me? I kept doing that all week while I was preparing this, and I couldn't get it out of my head. And I thought, because, yeah, that's right, bring me a higher love. I want a higher love. I want something bigger, greater, something other than. A love that keeps on loving when the recipient is unkind, unlovable, unworthy. A love that desires only for the good of the one being loved. And it's so easy to say that when you put yourself in the shoes of the person who's unlovable, unworthy. But flip the script and imagine giving love to someone who is unkind to you, someone who doesn't deserve your love, someone who you view as unworthy. That, my friends, is much harder to do. Much, much harder to do. And we get a closer snapshot of what this kind of love looks like in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is often called the love chapter. You may have heard it at, every wedding ever, maybe? Just for kicks and giggles. Oh, so this is the one, love is patient, love is kind. So if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast. How many of you had this quoted at your wedding? I mean, I didn't. I just wanted to give you a cue. How many of you were at a wedding and heard it quoted? Okay, that's mostly everyone. And it's something that we hear and we're familiar with, and yet most of the time we go, that's beautiful, but we don't really dig in deeper and know, what does this mean? Especially, what does this mean outside the context of marriage? Because Paul's not talking to a married couple. No, as a matter of fact, I think in order to talk about this, we really need to do a real quick recap on Corinthians. So a couple weeks ago, I did a message on sacred spaces, and we talked about how your body is a temple. You are a temple. You find the Spirit of God within. And I mentioned that in Corinthians is basically a letter, and it's a letter to this church in Corinth that Paul founded. And the apostle Paul, he founded this church basically in this seedy port town in south central Greece. And it's flooded with sex, wealth, a large transient population. So people are coming in, coming, going, lots of culture, diversity. And modern scholars liken it to like underbelly of Hollywood or New York City, Vegas. That you kind of get that sense. It's like gritty. And so Paul has this church that he founds there, and then he hears later reports that this church he founded is really conflicted, very divided. Some are choosing sides on this, some are choosing sides on that. They're fighting, they're arguing, and he sees that they are split. And so Paul decides to take his thoughts to pen and paper and write them a letter, which we have in the form of 1 Corinthians. And he doesn't hold back his thoughts. I imagine Paul to probably be one that's quite zealous and feels free to share his mind. And he identifies that the church has started operating in a very, very different way than he intended, that they've fallen out of unity and into divisiveness. So this sort of sets the tone, if you will, for this love chapter, which is kind of ironic. Like, wait a minute, this thing we always hear at weddings is actually about this really divided church. Yeah. So the church in Corinth also had super opposing views on spirituality. It was kind of this fight and this argument. By and large, they had the spirituality that had an outward appearance of religion, but basically they had abandoned their Christian ethics, which was by and large love. So they look like one thing, but they're really another. You could say they were like a tree, seemingly healthy, but bearing rancid, bitter fruit. Created for one thing, yet quickly becoming known for something else, something less life-giving. So Paul launches into this laundry list of religious activities and practices, and he's noting that they have zero benefit for you. All these things he's listing off have zero benefit for you if you don't have love. And Paul has a lot to say about their behavior and the behavior of love. And so let's take a quick look at part of that chapter 13 from the beginning. Paul says, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to the hardship so that I may boast, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. See, Paul is saying without love, your spiritual practices, your religion, your thoughts, your giving to the poor, even your kind things, your giving, your knowledge, your insight, Paul says is nothing but noise. Now, the metaphor of a clanging cymbal is quite intentional. And if you start digging in deeper, you find that this is actually quite on purpose. That an ancient cymbal, it wouldn't have been made by hand like we see, or it would have been made by hand and not factory made like we see here. Now, some of these fancy ones, I don't know, do you think this is hand hammered? Yeah, it is. We've got two different opposing views. Maybe hand hammered. Okay, so for any of you music nerds, you might know this, that some of the nice expensive cymbals you see are hand hammered. They're actually custom. But some, and you'll hear in the tone, aren't hand hammered, they're factory made. They kind of have this sizzle. And the cymbals back then would have been made by a hammered bronze, something sturdy, but something that would have had this hollowness to it. And I don't have a gong, so we won't get the same hollowness. Are you awake? You awake now? That works, right? Every time you guys start falling asleep, I'll just hit. It would have had a deeper hollow sound, or it would have been like zills. Have you guys ever seen belly dancing? The little tiny finger cymbals, they're called zills. Or it would have been like that. So it would have been this hollow gong or this tink, and that would have been the sound. So you get this hollow or this fading little noise. And he chose this clearly as a sign that this sound would have been dark, hollow, empty. He's also borrowing language that they would have understood deeply, that cymbals were used during ceremonies and rituals at the time. So that's the ironic thing. He's also using language they know. They use cymbals. They use cymbals in their practice, in their rituals, and in their worship. And he's reminding them again and again that their practices that they were familiar with, that they knew, left them feeling empty. There's this hollowness to this sound. And it goes on, and it echoes on, but it's empty. And he's making a clear statement while he's using the word resounding, which is a Greek word, ekos, or echo. And he's making a very clear statement that this means that it's a loud or a confusing noise. So this clear statement is that without love, the motivation behind any of your intentions, any of your rituals, anything that you do is nothing but loud, confused, and a hollow, empty sound. Without love, it is loud and it is hollow. Now, I know I'm likening this to the church a lot because, after all, that's who Paul is writing to. But I think this is important for this time because it's important for us to remember why we do the things we do in the first place. Why are we here? But it's also important to note when we're in a country like the United States that's extremely polarized and extremely divided, I think we need to be tethered to love. And it's harder to do than we think, but we need to let love lead the way. And so then he goes on to say the portion that most of us are familiar with. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others, and it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Paul then proceeds to say that love never fails. And a lot of times I think we interpret that as you'll never really be let down by love. And I think a lot of our lives would tell us otherwise. What this means is by love never failing, it means love endures. Love never ceases to exist. That love never ends. And then he summarizes everything by saying these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So Paul's words, however ancient, I think they still give some insight on the word today. And it's, again, I say this so many times, it's ironic how sometimes I read a story in Scripture and I think there's no way that this is going to do anything for this topic. And it shocks me how much I go, wow, yes, time was very, very differently then, but humanity still has some really common threads. And I think some of our behaviors, maybe our actions change, but some of our core motivators and behaviors haven't really changed since the beginning of time. And I don't know that they will, but I think we try to choose to do so. And so Paul's words is basically saying that he's trying to give this community love, an insight on love. And I think we can learn from that view and maybe take a higher view and go, oh yeah, we can kind of see how that correlates. And that if God is love, as we just read in Scripture earlier, that this also gives us insight on the very nature and character of God as well. And that's something to keep in mind, that when we're reading this, not only is this a way that we are supposed to follow, but this is a way that's mirrored in how God loves. Jesus and Paul talk about love and correlate that teaching towards actions, not feelings. And when we think of love, most of us think of like being Twitter-pated and like, oh, they're so wonderful. And we're talking about an action. We're talking about an action. And so that changes things when we talk about loving your neighbor, or, as we talked about last week, loving your enemies. That changes everything because it's not saying, oh, all of a sudden you have to develop warm feelings for them. That's not what this is saying. It's not saying like, oh, just conjure up some sort of false emotion towards this people group, towards this person that hurts you, towards this person that frustrates you, towards this person that makes you mad. However, what it's talking about is an attitude. This kind of agape love doesn't always come naturally to us. That's why it's called a higher love. That's why it's called a divine love. So you could say, in a sense, that love is a choice. It's something we have to work towards. And yet, ironically, we reside in naturally all the same because God is within. And love, according to Paul, isn't just some abstract idea. And we'll tie this in the next few weeks, this abstract idea becoming clearer and clearer. His definition is that it's behavior, and anything short of action isn't love at all. He makes a bold statement. This makes sense on a real practical level. And it does, that if you tell someone that you love them, but you ignore them or you treat them horribly, is that really love? And that's a very practical level. That if you offer someone your thoughts and prayers, but you don't actually ever do anything, is that love? That hits home for a lot of us. And that, my friends, is passive. When we don't act. That's passive. And the only time we see that love is passive in the passive state is the first word that Paul mentions about love. Love is patient. That is the first word that's passive. Patience waits. Patience does nothing but wait. That's passive. But then the next word is an action. It's kindness. It's something you do. It's something you do. And then from then on, every single thing that we read is an action state. It's a verb. How many of you grew up with DC Talk? Love is a verb. It's a verb. We're not talking about a noun. We're talking about a verb, proclaiming what love does and what doesn't do. And so a quick list here. We have a quick breakdown on how that description is. So we see love is patient. That's the first one, which is passive. Then we see kind, which is an action. Then we see love is not, which shows us ways we shouldn't be acting. It's not envious, boastful, proud, self-seeking, easily angered. Love does not. So now we see a way we don't act. It doesn't dishonor, keep records of wrongs, delight in evil. And then love does. It rejoices in truth. It protects. It trusts. It hopes and perseveres. So here we see a whole lot of attitude and action. We see that love is an attitude. Love is choosing to view someone as a human with dignity, first and foremost. And I think in our culture right now, that's hard to do. I said this before, but you can easily get caught up in a whirlwind, especially on social media, where you forget that the other person is a person. And so we get caught up in this thought, and sometimes our ego is the thing that's driving it. The ego becomes the driving force. Well, I'll tell them. I have the right response. I have this to say. Or even a prideful, arrogant, well, I'm not going to show them, but I'm just going to be smarter and have the best answer. And if you check the motivation behind that, and I know we might dig into this a few in the next couple weeks, but before you say something, especially to someone you don't like, check your motivation behind why you're saying it. That's a really, really good indicator to know what your motivation is. Is it love or is it ego? And I guarantee most of us, it's ego. Most of us, it's ego first. This is why it says love is patient, because why? What's the first thing you should do? The first thing you should do is sit and wait. The first thing you should do is sit and wait. Think before you type. Think before you speak. Then when you speak, you'll know, is this kind? Is this good? Is this helpful? Is this necessary? Then we see that love is an action. And when we act in love, we act in the very nature of the divine, as we explored. And then lastly, love is a practice. The worship team can come up at this time. Love is a practice. It's not something that we do easily. Like a fluent language, like learning the hardest language that we can know to mankind. It takes practice. Author Don Miguel Ruiz says, to become masters of love, we have to practice love. To become masters of love, we have to practice love. Now, if there's anything anyone knows about practicing anything, it means you're going to mess up a whole bunch before you figure it out. If you're learning an instrument, you're going to be terrible for a really long time until one day you're not. If you're learning a language, you're going to fumble and say the wrong words. That might sound like one word and you said a different word and it ends up offensive and you go, how did I say that? Until eventually one day it becomes second nature and you got it. Love takes practice. And so it's not something that I am a professional in. And so if you get the idea that I'm coming in here going, you all need to be loving, we need to be loving. And so in this next moment, I want to invite you to sit and listen to how we can be in unity. That it's easy for us who have a narrative to easily make the other person the bad guy. When we are over here, even if we've been wounded, it's really easy for us to make an us against them narrative. As the first song we sang, we reject the either or. That is one of my favorite lines. We reject the either or, because if it's us and for them, or if it's us and them, it's us for them. And that's the kind of attitude I'd like to adopt, which means for one church, there's times where the other, now we are a pretty loving and open community. So for some churches, the other would be us. Can I get an amen? For our community, the other will be them. For our community, the other might be the person that isn't so loving. So how do we show love to the unkind? And it's easy for us to go, well, we're open and we're loving and we're affirming and we're this. But where is that motivation coming from? Our pride, our ego, or love? And let love be the motivator.